My children are going to inherit a collection of swords, including the replica Narsil, but,
God, my children are going to inherit a whole lot of obsolete physical media.
What do we do with this shiny disc?
This episode of Draft Zero is brought to you by ScriptUp. They are industry expert story and script consultants who don't promise that access to industry bullshit. They just want to make your script better.
They offer excellent service, giving you a report and, most importantly, a Zoom call to discuss your script. We've used their service and can vouch for it. So if you're looking for experienced, independent insight into how your story and script is working, consider using ScriptUp. And if you tell them that Draft Zero sent you by using the promo code DZ10, then you'll get 10% off.
Hi, I'm Chaz Fisher.
And I'm Stu Willis.
And welcome to Draft Zero, a podcast where two Australian filmmakers try to work out what makes great screenplays work.
And in this episode, which is going to be part one of 2 parts, for reasons that we'll explain, we are going to be looking at talismans, which is essentially the idea of using objects to help us track character journeys, give us insight into character emotions. Basically, I think using objects to help us get access to the interiority of a character.
How to dramatize the ephemeral, intangible, make the intangible tangible. We were inspired to do this topic, and I'll explain why this is a planned 2-part episode. Most of the times we just record too long and a single episode becomes 2, but this time we've actually planned to do 2 episodes. So we were inspired by Scott Myers, Go Into the Story, did a great blog post about talismans, and we'll go into his definition and where we agree and where we might push it a little bit further. And the idea for the episode was to focus specifically on how physical objects can be an external, visual, tangible dramatization of what you just said, what the character is going through, a kind of external tracker for what the character is going through and how they're changing. And we were going to do our normal format of picking 3 films with good talismans and analyze them. But we were getting into the weeds so much as to, like, our introduction felt like it was going to be, like an hour to an hour and a half of creating like groundwork and taxonomy. And often what you and I have found is that when we actually take a break, when we're doing a series of episodes, we, in between times and in the post-production of an episode, come up with a whole lot of different ideas. So that's the second episode is going to focus on good examples of tracking, of how talismans can track internal character journeys. And at the moment, we're looking at THOR 4, Love and Thunder, and In the Mood for Love, and we are polling our Patreons for the third choice. But this one, Stu, what is this episode going to be more focused on?
As you say, a taxonomy of talismans. So let's start with the broad definition that Scott Myers gives, which he says that a talisman is any physical object which takes on a symbolic meaning to a character or characters. For Scott, from what I understand, he's got an interest in Jungian psychology. He's very much interested in the kind of psychological, spiritual elements of the talisman, and I think that's something that's, given his background, makes sense. For me, talismans have been something that I'm thinking about a lot recently, and this is me oversharing on the podcast, but this year has been a year of physical journeys, a transitional year, right? So I've moved into a new house with my new partner. I moved out of my old studio of 6.5 years. I finally moved out some boxes from my former partner's place that had been there for like 4 years, right? And so there's a lot of unpacking going along.
Internal and external.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of stuff. And there was a particular moment about 6 weeks ago that very awful circumstances had to fly interstate for the funeral of a dear friend who I went to film school with. And then I come back and I've unfortunately we're at that age now, I think, where people start, you're old enough to see people that are older than you and younger than you dying. And I do have like a box of kind of those funeral pamphlets, right? And I've had a few pinned up on my wall, and I had them in a box, and I took them out, and Emma's like, oh, I can put them, and she meant this innocently. She's like, I can put them in my junk file, right? Like I've got like a file that I put loose papers in, and like, these are not junk, right? And like in the end, yes, they're just literally pieces of paper, often really crumpled because they've been in like a suit jacket for, a whole day and then moved around interstate. But they carry a lot of emotional connection to me, right? And I think the power of talismans is I think they're actually quite a fundamental part of the human condition. Right? I'm putting that in quotation marks because I think that the human condition implies a universality that may not exist, right? And often it can be a way of monoculturing human experiences. But I think talismans do exist across cultures and most cultures, and they are part of human life. You're wearing a wedding band now. I mean, maybe you've actually taken it off, right? But, jewelry is a big part of how people attach symbolic meaning. Like we attach symbolic meaning to everything. Most religions, the iconography of religions gains its power through the attachment of meaning to it, right? Yeah. And there is a lot of iconography that is reviled. I'm not going to name what it is, but because of the meaning it connotes. So talismans are really interesting to me because there are something that is not artificial to screenwriting or drama, right? It's something that's actually part of people's lives and how we live our lives and how we understand and build the meaning of our lives. But they also happen to be really good particularly for screenwriting because they have a visual element. So often talismans are a great way of letting us access that character interiority. It doesn't necessarily have to be emotional often, but emotion and psychology we should see them as connected. But the way that cultures work and that the character, how people think and feel, I guess, is what I mean by the interiority without them necessarily having to articulate them. So that's why I've been interested in deep diving into talismans. And it's something that I think a lot of people they use, it's the whole, films should be about dialogue and action. And the fact is our lives are full of stuff, right? And it's like, stuff is part of what we do and part of the human existence. So how can we use stuff to tell stories better?
Well, also, it's just a third very distinct tool. So the way that I predominantly think about how you would track a character changing would be either through choices. So you're putting them in plot circumstances where they get to make very similar choices, but they make it either the same or differently, and you're tracking it that way. Or, as you said, their relationship with other characters. So if a character, falls in love and then breaks up, you are tracking, change in who they are in relationship to others. But the useful thing about talismans is that they are not a character, as we will get into, because I think that is we've been mentioning like a
I think at the time, I think characters can become talisman and talismans become character. I think they functional.
Sure.
It's a functional thing as opposed to a static thing.
Sure. I don't want to get too didactic as it's almost a mission in Draft Zero to actually be as least specific as possible. But I think the way a character would interact with a physical object is very different to the way a character would, make choices or interact with characters or sentient beings. And so it's just another tool to add to the belt as to have various choices.
I think we'll come back to unpack that. So let's to use as a starting point, like Scott talks about talismans, yes, as physical objects which take on symbolic meaning. For him, they have particularly three aspects, right? They need to be tangible, right? It needs to be something that's physical, right? And look, I think that has a utility for screenwriting. I was reading a very sad Reddit post about a young woman whose boyfriend passed away a few months ago. And he had a particular brand of cologne that he used to wear. And she's got a coworker who is wearing that cologne. And it is absolutely, understandably quite triggering, right? But that is not something, that smell is not something that you can easily translate to screenwriting, right?
Yeah.
And look, smell obviously has a physical component to it. But, I think the tangibility is something that is specifically like, can we render it on screen? And I think music can be used. I mean, music is used in my life I've got very strong connections to music. I'm just rearranging my vinyl collection. But, it's, as that implies, there's a physical connection to it, right? And you can show that on screen.
That to me is the most useful thing about talismans is how dramatizable they are. Because I think a lot of what a screenwriting challenge is the screenwriter has an idea in their head, particularly about the interiority of characters, like our understanding of who characters are. And then we write a script and someone else reads it and they understand that character to be often wildly different from who we as writers think of those characters.
I think writers have we in writing will have access to the interiority of our characters that our audience don't.
Yeah.
And I think particularly baby writers, you can see it, but people will defend, that's not what this character would do, or the character's not like this, or the way they talk about the character, and it's like, there is nothing on the page and eventually on the screen that is going to tell us any of that stuff. You know it because it's in your head and how you understand the character, but it's not how you've communicated that to the audience. So the tangibility makes it communicable. Right.
Sorry, I interrupted you. So tangibility, point one.
Yeah, and speaking of communicable, another thing is they should be a carrier of emotional attachment. Okay, and I think that I feel like I'll add my. I'm adding my commentary. Like I was going to say, my thing is like the emotional attachment comes from the character, not the object itself, right? I think them being a possible carrier of emotional attachment is anything that's tangible that the character kind of imprints themselves and develops. And for me, as I've been thinking about Talismans, and hopefully we can unpack over this episode and the next and the following episode, is that the relationship between the character and the object or the space, because I think locations are objects, I guess, can have emotional attachment as long as the character gives them emotion.
Yeah.
Okay. And I think the other thing that Scott Myer says is important about Talisman is that they're a reminder for the character and thus the audience. Okay. So I think that's interesting because that's actually really about the relationship and the way it's been set up. Okay.
Yeah.
So an example of a talisman that I think is really effective and is a good example of how you can use something as simple to show character journey is in the original Top Gun. Maverick is given Goose's dog tags. Okay. And he kind of holds on to them, talk to me, Goose, talk to me.
Come on, Maverick! What the hell are you doing? Maverick, get in there, for Christ's sake! Ice is in trouble. He's got no cover. Get in there, Maverick.
And he literally like clings onto them in his hand. And at the end of the film, he throws them away, right? Like he is overcoming his grief. And that's a very classic kind of talismanic idea, that reminder. There's people hold on to all sorts of reminders in terms of grief, right?
Yeah.
We White Lotus had all the stuff around ashes. And, when you're burying people, that whole idea of like, yep, I haven't decided what to do the ashes yet. And they just sit there for like 2 years. And so that reminder works for the character and for the audience. But I think the important thing about it being a reminder is it's less the object. I think maybe the object needs to be distinctive. Okay. And maybe there's a category of talismans which can be more iconographic in the same way that a crucifix is iconographic. So it's not it's not this specific cross. It's all crosses have a talismanic power to a particular character, right? But the important thing is the reminder that there's some kind of imprinting process. I think that is, or there's probably, I don't know why I picked the word imprinting. Maybe we can try to come up, like, there is this moment where we tell the audience, the character has a moment where they bond with the object.
Yeah.
And there is a moment when the audience understand what that bond is. And sometimes that character's bond with the object can be off screen, right? Like if they are wearing a wedding ring, we don't need to see the marriage, right? Because that is a talisman within our culture.
Out of those three, to me, the reminder being for the character it's true, but to me, it's just an extension of it being a carrier of emotional attachment. And what it being a quote reminder to me is Scott saying when the character engages with its talisman on an emotional basis, they are reminded of what it means. And by extension, if you have told the audience what it means, then they are reminded. I'm not trying to be critical here. I think Scott's got some really good analysis here, but to me, it being a reminder for the character is exactly the same thing of it saying it's a carrier of emotional attachment.
I think the important thing is that when you unpick it, that there is a moment where you understand what it means, right? Because there can be an object that has we understand has emotional significance to a character, but we don't actually know what it's specifically reminding that character of, right? It's just something, there is a whole bunch of stuff. Like you set dress any location, right? And there's going to be a bunch of stuff in there that whether it's the director, the actor, the set dressers, set deck, whatever, you're making, or the writer who's putting stuff in there are making a whole bunch of decisions of things that have got emotional, in theory, have emotional attachment to the character, right? But because the audience doesn't understand what any of that means, it doesn't actually function on a story level.
Yeah.
Right? Like it might be an Easter egg, like, oh, look, in Andor, there's like a Sith and Jedi holocron on the background, right? But it's an Easter egg, right? It's not serving any kind of dramatic purpose.
Well, we're going to refer back to this conversation a lot because you and I and our long-suffering editor, Chris, engaged in a mammoth debate about what talismans are and are not. And I think you drew the distinction, and we're going to get to, in our taxonomy, like classic examples, but photos are one. And there's a great deal of difference between photos that are in the background of someone's house that you pan across to give the audience some feeling, like basically set dressing exposition for who that character is and who their relationships are and whether they're dusty or not. You know, they may actually have no more emotional attachment to the character because they don't, see them anymore. And there's a great deal of difference between that and a photo that a character has in their wallet or that they bring out or like fold it up in their back pocket or that they keep all the time.
Yeah, what I call, which is I think is like the integration, right, of the object. So there's these other things that I'm beginning to think about and I'm kind of is condensing, right?
Yeah.
So one of them is how obvious the object is as being a talisman, right? So literally, are you signaling to the audience that this thing is something we need to pay attention to, right? Or the other way is maybe visibility is a better term, how visible this thing is, like how much you're emphasizing it, right? But I also think there needs to be an awareness. How aware of is the character of this thing being important to them? Because I actually think the power comes from the character investing meaning into it, right? The object is tangible and it's being vested with emotion, right? Or with, let's just say, meaning. The meaning could be emotional, but it could be something else, right?
Yeah.
Like the butt plugs from Everything Everywhere all at once, right? They're not talismans, because there's a setup, but they have no emotional meaning to the characters.
Yeah.
Right. Maybe the Jamie Lee Curtis character, right, because they're her awards, but there's no payoff to that. They don't, like, she isn't suddenly horrified that people are using her hard-earned awards as sex toys.
Well, they aren't. They're using them as emotional triggers to connect across multiverses.
Yes. So I think maybe it's as simple as that, right? Look, my thesis at the moment, and I'm interested to see how it develops over this episode and in the following one, is that the degree of meaning that the character puts into the object and that we see that and we understand that is what actually makes the talismans powerful, right? I think they lose power the less we understand what they mean to the world and to the character. So I think that's kind of how there were tools to think about in terms of how that may happen, but they gain their power from they literally gain meaning by being vested in meaning.
100%. And by extension, our control as writers is that they gain more meaning through our presentation of them. Like a character might have a wedding ring and it is probably meaningful to that character, but unless it forms part of the story and the writer is drawing attention to it in some way, it's kind of irrelevant to the story.
Yeah, so maybe relevancy is like, how relevant is it? Like, it needs to be imbued with meaning and the story needs to be saying, it's like the visibility thing, but it's like you need to relevancy.
What we want to talk about briefly is what to us are not talismans, physical objects that are part of storytelling that are not talismans. And the reason we want to do that is not to be didactic in any way. It's not that, a physical symbol in a story that is not imbued with emotional attachment or relevance by a character is not an elegant part of storytelling. It's that if we start calling every physical object in film a talisman, it kind of loses value as a tool to go, oh, I'm struggling to represent the interiority of my character. How could I better portray that with a talisman?
Yeah, Because, yes, on some level, everything in a film is symbolically loaded.
Or ought to be.
Or ought to be. I mean, it is, whether or not the filmmakers intended.
It will be given meaning whether they intend it or not.
Yes. Let's unpack this a little bit further, because I want to think about, like, we've done an earlier episode on MacGuffins, which if you haven't listened to, you should. But there's also just objects that are purely symbolic. When we're talking to our Patreons about our objects, like films with good uses of talismans, my mum suggested The Night in Searching for Bobby Fischer, right? So where the character whose name escapes me, Josh is associated through the filmmaking with the knight, because he's a prodigy, chess prodigy, right? Who doesn't cheat and
doesn't have butt plugs that we're aware of.
Wow, that's about children.
I'm referring to the cheater.
Oh,
who
yeah,
is accused of having
Sorry.
vibrating anal beads.
So he's associated that. So we understand on some level that the filmmaking is representing this character's integrity and his battle to maintain being a good person while being a prodigy. Because in some ways, that story. Can you be a top competitive sports person while maintaining a degree of integrity? And his favorite piece is the knight, and there's a whole bunch about things about him using the knight and it representing his integrity. But the fact is, Josh is not aware at all. It's his favorite piece, but it does not have meaning to him. So I think in the stricter definition, yes, it's symbolic, right? So on the one level, it is talisman. The way I want to talk about talismans, I don't want to be talking about stuff that is purely symbolic, that characters are not aware of.
Yeah.
That may be incorrectly aware of what something means, or we may attach more meaning to it than they do. But I think it's important that they have a meaning. This is going to be the other thing. They have a relationship with the object.
So another example of something that absolutely can be a talisman, but is often not, is wardrobe. Well, because we were arguing with Chris, and suddenly he was pushing very hard on us to tackle Breaking Bad
And Better Call Saul.
Because he loves how tightly integrated almost the entirety of that show is. Like, there's many visual symbols, whether it's, mise en scène, whether it's wardrobe, whether it's,
literally the pilot of Breaking Bad opens on a cow pat, and it says that in the script, right?
Yeah.
Like, that is not almost every, I don't want to say every episode, a lot of episodes open up on an object whose significance is going to be revealed over the course of the episode.
Or over the season. Like the stuff that was from the plane crash.
Oh, yeah.
That was almost a whole season until we realized what that shit floating in the pool actually meant.
Yes.
It's not a talisman.
Yeah, it's symbolic.
Mm-hmm, very. And foreshadowing.
Yes.
So, but to hook back into wardrobe, there was a lot of use of wardrobe to track different characters, and in many films, but, in particularly Breaking Bad, Walt's wardrobe and his hairstyle, for example, is tracking who he is as a character, but he's not aware of that. And by distinct contrast, Jimmy McGill, or Saul Goodman, is very conscious of his wardrobe and how that portrays himself. Like, I've only just finished the final season.
Oh, you just finished it?
Just finished it.
Nice.
And it was fascinating, even in the black and white sections, when he's planning the theft of the department store, how he lingers on this shirt and tie combination that, even though it's in black and white, we just know how incredibly loud that shirt and tie combination is, because he wants to make a statement. And by him picking out that shirt and tie combination and then leaving it on the rack, that is talismanic, because it means something to him. It's him going, I wish I was still Saul Goodman, and I'm leaving it behind on the rack.
Yeah. You don't even have to do it as a track. It could just be a quick cut, right? I because of Rings of Power, we slowly rewatched Lord of the Rings as let's watch half an hour or 10 minutes or an hour of the original trilogy. And just that moment where Aragorn, after they win at Gondor, at Minas Tirith, and you cut to him wearing the, the tunic of Gondor with the tree, right? And suddenly it's like he's taking his place as the king. That's it. That's the it is telling you what has happened. We don't see him take action. We are literally, because those films, absolutely, I mean, fantasy is absolutely almost always about objects imbued with an incredible amount of symbolic meaning to character, like to a specific character, but also characters. Like, he makes the ghost soldiers bow to him because he's welding the reforged Narsil. But so wardrobe can be talismanic, but yeah, it's a good example. I think Breaking Bad, Walt isn't. And there's also Walt Jr. in early seasons is wearing colors that are kind of very similar to his dad's, but once he starts deciding that that Mr. White is a bit of a dickhead, Walt Jr. no longer wears colors that mirror his dad's, right? And that's often something that good costume designers will work you with as a director, being like, this is how we can connect these characters in terms of colors and stuff like that. You are tracking the journey visually, and there's lots of things that you can do as filmmakers to tell the story and track character journeys, but the characters themselves may not be aware of it.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, it's not to say that maybe Aragorn didn't give a shit about that tunic. Maybe he spent 3 days choosing which tunic to wear that would most portray his kingliness, but the storytellers decided not to demonstrate to us that tunic was a talisman.
Yeah. I think it's kind of like it is on some level a talisman. It's just not a very powerful one. Like, it's a symbolic shift of him becoming increasingly king-like. So when he eventually wears the crown, he's got the reforged sword, he gets the tunic, he ends up doing the haircut where he's got the high pony and the long flowing hair.
Hot Vigo.
Absolutely. Style icon. A whole bunch of stuff they're doing to track him moving away from being Strider and more being Aragorn, right? In terms of just hair and makeup and wardrobe in those films. But that's an example of a good talent. Like, it doesn't have meaning. Maybe it's a way of tracking character journeys through physical objects, whether it's talismanic. Yeah, maybe it's not because he himself doesn't attach much meaning to it, but it's a way of telling character journey. I mean, we could almost do talismans just as Lord of the Rings. But I think what's going to be, interesting is that these are very useful outside of like fantasy and science fiction. All right, but we're talking about things that aren't talismans and examples of how they're not talismanic.
Yeah.
The wardrobe is a common one, which is interesting because I think what is so fascinating about wardrobe, like the SAUL example, is that wardrobe is how people are choosing to present themselves to the world, and often we're putting on masks to be who we are. The example I often give is like, I go to a metal concert and suddenly I'm wearing like black pants, black shirt, jacket, and there are a lot of metalheads that they will put on their like battle vest as part of this ritual of going to see a gig, right? That wouldn't do it in other contexts, right? And so I think wardrobe is a great thing, but it isn't necessarily talismanic because, well, it can be. It can be, and I think it all comes down to the imbuement, that whole thing about the meaning for the character and the meaning for the audience, and those things both being on the surface. Yeah. Right? And that's where the power comes from. It kind of connects us to the character.
That moment that I just talked about in Better Call Saul, I could describe what he was feeling and what that meant for that character because of how they've imbued it and the choices that the writers have made.
His longing to go back to being Saul.
Yeah. Now, should we talk about talismans versus characters?
Yes.
Because you and I, we've already flagged a potential disagreement here. To me, a talisman is a physical object because to me is a more useful tool. It's not a character. I mean, Scott in his own blog, he referenced Wilson the Ball in Castaway as a talisman, and to me it almost kind of lost its talismanic quality because he imbued it with as a character. Like I can't even remember Tom Hanks's character's name in Castaway, but he is using it to argue with himself internally.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. When you're saying it's lost its talismanic quality, are you saying it then loses a certain kind of emotional power? What is it about it?
It gained power.
Is it a definition thing?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'm being too didactic here, but the fact that he basically engaged in arguments, he used it, the character used Wilson the Ball to have someone to talk to. So in that way, I guess it was a talisman from a craft perspective in that it's allowing the externalization and the dramatization of the internal, but it was really to give voice to something.
I mean, I would say it's got a symbolic meaning to the cat. Like on Scott's definition, I agree with Scott.
It's got a huge emotional, like when Wilson floats away, it's like the most emotional part of the whole movie.
Wilson! Wilson! I'm sorry! I'm sorry, Wilson! Wilson, I'm sorry! I'm sorry! Wilson! I can't! Wilson!
Yeah, and I actually think the fact that he's imbued it with so much meaning that we almost think of it as a character is actually what makes it really powerful, right? In the same way that the ring in Lord of the Rings is borderline a character, right? Okay, and most of the time it isn't. There's just these moments when it seems to act with free will, and I want to unpack that a little bit more. That makes it feel like a character, but it's imbued heavily with meaning.
The ring yearns above all else to return to the hand of its master.
It implies a relationship, okay? And there'll be a point. At what point does this relationship is my relationship with this object becoming something more like a relationship between me and a real person? We're talking about the fact on screen that characters are fiction, right? Like they're not real people. All we know, and the illusion, the magic of good writing is it takes words and actions to make us think these things are real people. Okay, on some level. So I think, and there's all those interesting things like droids. Can droids be like in Star Wars? There's some of them are more character-like and some of them are more talismanic, or some of them that are just objects, right? So I think the relationship is an important part between the character and the object, as that is part of what gives us meaning.
Yes.
I think there are two things that create characters. One is that characters, almost by definition, take action. Okay. And that action implies a free will. Wilson, unlike the ring, never seems to be acting of its own accord.
Yeah.
Okay. The ring of power has these moments where you're like, ooh, is that the ring's will or not?
It whispers. Like they've given it voice.
Yeah, and at that point, I think maybe it is kind of slightly erring into being a character at that moment. Okay. The other thing I think that's really interesting about characters, and this is related to action, but it's about the illusion of free will, is I was working many years ago on a project, a virtual life project, right, a virtual pet, and I was reading a whole bunch of papers about how people begin to associate personality with objects, like particularly around like Sony and their pet dog. And the interesting thing for them is what they came to what I took away from this, not what they take to the conclusion to, what I took to the conclusion is disobedience. We start associating personality with physical objects when they don't do everything exactly the right way. The car that doesn't quite work all the time, the dishwashing, the washing machine, like that's when we start giving them personality, right? When they are slightly disobedient, it creates the illusion of free will, right? And so when they were doing like the dog and stuff like that, it's like it has to have this moment, like basically build in a randomness to do with like, will it actually follow you? And then people will, like Pavlov's dog, start to assume a personality. So I think you can give objects the illusion, like that randomness of disobedience, right? When it breaks out of being the object, like the ring of power doesn't quite make it a character, but it definitely makes it more character-like, like when we can assume like sentience based on action. And I think that's important because I think to give the flip side from Lord of the Rings is Arwen goes from being a character and becomes a talisman. Right? Like, I mean, she barely, like, she's definitely takes action. She's a character in Fellowship of the Ring. But Return of the King, she basically, once she's made the decision to, I choose a mortal life, right, is her last act of agency. And then it becomes like, Arwen's fate is tied to the fate of the ring. She will die. Her health, basically, she will decline in health.
She will lose HP points.
Yeah, right? Like, literally a talisman at that point. She's got symbolic meaning to Aragon. We're tracking what is going on in the world by the fact that she is losing HP points while lying in her bed and doing nothing. And she's not taking action. She is not a character at that point.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think it's a function as opposed to a static thing.
Yeah. And look, I don't want to become didactic here in that I don't want any of our listeners to go, oh, this object is becoming too sentient and is no longer a talisman. I must be doing something wrong, right? No, do whatever works for your story. The reason why I think I am pushing back a little bit on or resisting, the idea of even objects with agency, like droids or the One Ring, being talismans is, for me, the use of them, we relate very differently to objects. Now we can have such emotional attachment to objects that we will be terrified to look at them, and there are definitely characters out there that don't, in films, I wish I had a good example to pull from, but that they don't want to even think or see the talisman that is affecting them.
A lot of horror films will be about that. A lot of addiction stories will be dealing with that being triggering.
Yeah. So it's not that they're not powerful and not impactful on the characters, but it is solely within the characters' control isn't the right word, because if they could control the emotional reaction, then it would be different. But the talisman is not doing anything. And to me, when the talisman can do something, we react very differently. You've just said it yourself with this pet. We react very differently to something that has choices than we react to something that doesn't have choices.
The appearance of free will. So I think the use of, coming back to an example that we did in last episode, No Country for Old Men, I think the coins and the coin flipping is talismanic.
100%.
Right? It is symbolically, meaning it represents the role or the lack of fate. It's a very nihilistic, this idea, I'm going to flip a coin and it's going to choose whether you live or die. But the coin is deciding whether you live or die, right?
Well, they hang a hat on that, on whether it is or not. Like, they debate that.
Yeah, they do, right? But I think it's absolutely talismanic, and it's not that it's taking action, because it's not created to have the appearance of free will, but it's definitely not a static thing.
Yeah.
Okay. And I mean, I think that is like, coins are like, we'll eventually get to some broader categories of examples, quote unquote taxonomy. Two-Face and the coin, right? Like him flipping the coin and then it being revealed early on that it's actually got, what is it, heads on both sides, or is it tails? Heads on both sides.
Yeah.
Heads, I go through with it.
This is your life. You can't leave something like that to chance.
I'm not.
You make your own luck.
Just to be clear, Scott, in his blog post, breaks down every page reference in the script to the coin to credit his analysis.
Damn it! I wanted to take it, but it's both them using literally the same device of a coin and flipping a coin. Both films, underlying source material, use it to create different meaning. But it is something that is, if this was the ring of power, if this was a coin of power that was deciding like whether or not you were worthy, right? Would that stop it being a talisman? And
well, okay, so interestingly, and I think we're going to get into this in more depth, so I just want to raise it and then drop it because we're going to look at it in the next episode. I think Mjolnir for Thor is a talisman because it has rules. It chooses whether you're worthy or not, but it has rules. They make Stormbreaker a character in Love and Thunder. They literally, and the way that they frame it, give the Stormbreaker choices and make Thor interact with it in a way that he never interacts with Mjolnir.
Yep.
So not that they're good or bad, but they have got differences in how Thor as a character relates to them, because one has become a character, one has got sentience, one is given the appearance of free will, and the other just has rules.
That's interesting. I think that's your interpretation of the hammer. I think the hammer doesn't necessarily, I think it doesn't have rules. I think it's making choices because it's very it literally breaks its own, it decides Jane is worthy. It's just not as interactive, but also I don't think it fucking matters. I think they're both talismans. They're being used to tell a story about him. You could argue that, if Stormbreaker was a fucking dwarf or something, instead of a quote unquote inanimate object, maybe you would think of it as a character. And that is true, right? But I think the important thing then is that we're just saying anything that has a meaning to the character could be talismanic, and that is true.
Yeah.
Right?
But people are then talismans.
I just gave an example of one where yes, they are.
Yeah, but you used it interestingly as kind of somewhat critical because it's showing Arwen basically stops being a character and becomes a talisman by the absence of her agency.
Yeah, and so that's part of the problem with the damsel in distress kind of things, and we'll see other examples. I'm just arguing that it's functionality at this point.
And I don't want to get too didactic about it because one of the next categories that we wanted to discuss is like distinguishing between talismans and MacGuffins, and it's not to say that talismans can't be MacGuffins, right? There's a distinct overlap. I just think they're doing two different things and you have to be aware of both things, right? And in the same way, maybe a talisman can become a character or have, take on agency and free will and things like that. I'm not saying you shouldn't do that or can't do that. I just think that how a character interacts with something that has free will or the potential to make choices is very different to the way that a character would interact with an object that cannot.
I think these things are spectrum-based in the same way that sentience is spectrum-based and our understanding of agency is spectrum-based, right? Like, does a tree, now that we're beginning to understand that trees live in communities that are highly communicative, does that mean that trees are no longer talismans, that we should be thinking of them as characters, like they're animals? Are pets, right? Is the dog in a Road Warrior a talisman or is it a character, right? And doesn't matter. And I think ultimately it is partly functional, and maybe part of the interesting idea then is to break down what the difference of that function is. To from a dramatic, like an external, what is the writer's purpose here, and an internal, what is the purpose within the world.
Yes.
But I would just say for the Thor thing is, for me, part of it is that the audience and Thor on some level understand Stormbreaker as being symbolic. He understands it is a symbol. Yes, he's treating it as if it has a personality and all those things. But on the other hand, like, it could also be his fucking car.
There's literally a shot where it drifts into scene staring at the side of his head, forcing him to acknowledge it.
Is the car in Knight Rider?
I'd say that's a character more than a talisman.
Is the Millennium Falcon a character, and is it a character before or after Solo, a Star Wars story?
Okay, so one of the things I actually liked about Solo is how they,
put the sentient character and made it an indentured slave.
Not that, but more that they gave a kind of somewhat explanation as to why the Millennium Falcon felt like it had character. But what you were talking about in terms of reliability, that was triggering in me, that's the Millennium Falcon. It breaks down arbitrarily, and that gave that spaceship more feeling of character than any spaceship, I think, in the history of cinema beforehand.
Yeah, the spaceship in 2001, Hal, nothing. No personality with Hal at all.
Okay, so I'd see Hal as not a ship. He's like a computer programmer, but then we're just getting into the weeds. But he's a character. Hal is a character.
Yeah, takes action.
He's not a talisman.
No.
But the Millennium Falcon is very much a talisman.
Yeah, until it isn't. So, I mean, that's just that interesting that, because a lot of the classic examples that we'll break down to, they will all have versions of. Okay, so let's just talk briefly about MacGuffins before we talk about the classic examples.
Yeah. So, like you said, we did a MacGuffins episode. And it's fascinating to me that for anyone who hasn't listened to the episode, I encourage you. It's one of our early ones, but I'm quite happy with it. I encourage you to go back and listen to it.
I remastered it a few years ago. Oh, you know that?
I did not know that. Or I probably did and then promptly forgot it as not an important piece of information to store in my brain. But thank you for doing that. So we compared and contrasted different adventure films based solely on looking at them through the lens of the power of the MacGuffin. And we compared Raiders of the Lost Ark with Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, and in particular the Curse of the Black Pearl with On Stranger Ties. And it was fascinating that we were talking about, in that instance, the quote-unquote good film in each of those franchises. What we found there is that the films that were not as good in those entries to the franchises had MacGuffins that where the characters did not have much emotional attachment. Indy did not really give a shit about finding the crystal skull. Jack Sparrow expressly said that he did not want to find the Fountain of Youth, right?
There was no meaning between the character and the object.
So it wasn't a talisman. Now, that's not to say that MacGuffin... I think they're two different things. A MacGuffin, like, let me give you an example of a great MacGuffin where the characters have zero emotional attachment is the suitcase in both Ronin and Pulp Fiction.
I thought you were going to say the Mad Men episode, but those two also work.
So a MacGuffin is something that everyone is chasing or is after or is driving a plot, right? And there are tangible physical objects that drive the plot of films, and they don't have to have the characters imbuing emotional attachment into them to be perfectly successful at driving the plot. But in terms of MacGuffins, they can also be talismanic, and we've seen in that episode, I think, the very emotional attachment that the protagonist attaches to those physical objects makes them important. And I think in Ark of the Covenant, like in Raiders of the Lost Ark, Indy doesn't have an emotional attachment to the Ark of the Covenant really until he's got the bazooka trained on it in the canyon.
But it has a meaning to him.
Yeah, I mean, he wants to get to it first. He wants to get it before the Nazis do, but it's not it itself. Do you know what I mean? It could be any other object of historical significance. But the Ark itself seems to only gain emotional import to Indy later in the story. And in fact, you know, everyone talks about it, like his decision to believe that the Ark has power and isn't just an object of significance is somewhat a leap of faith.
Yeah.
And it's what saves him at the end of the film.
And it's uncharacteristic.
Yes.
Until that point.
And so it becomes a talisman. It becomes a way of tracking Indy's internal journey. Yeah. I don't think it is I think it starts out as a MacGuffin and continues to be a MacGuffin for the whole film, but becomes more of a talisman. It gains more emotional attachment. It serves more to track Indy's change, such as it is, as the film goes on.
So the interesting thing to think about is then how are we tracking the change? Because an episode... I rewatched most of the Fly episode of Breaking Bad, which is from season 3. I think it's like episode 10. And it's, for those who haven't seen it, or for those who haven't need a reminder, it's the bottle episode where there's a fly trapped in the lab and Walt basically is getting to lose his mind, becoming super obsessive about killing the fly. It is absolutely, on one level, talismanic. Right? Like he's attached a whole bunch of meaning and symbolic meaning on this fly. We need to kill this fly, otherwise our whole batch is ruined.
Is he aware that he is attaching the symbolism, like all the other, like Jesse's definitely aware?
Yeah, I mean, neither of them are having the larger discussion of like, this is kind of the microscope. This is really about Walt's obsession about making the best fucking meth in the world. Right, like why is he actually doing any of this? I think he does, and he's definitely got a symbolic meaning. But what is interesting about this, right, is he has a symbolic meaning to it. The story is about using the object to dramatize a whole bunch of shit that Walt is going through at that time in his relationship with Jesse, like the fact that he hits Jesse and then Jesse hits him back, and then he tells Jesse, you know, he locks Jesse out, and then Jesse fucking comes back with the bags, and Walt kind of reluctantly realizes that maybe he's not a fucking genius after all, but also really arrogant. All that stuff's in there. The fly itself, the object of their obsession, does not change at all. Right, it becomes a way of manifesting it, but there is actually no change within the object itself, and there's no really a change in relationship. But I think that's the difference, because there is the way that you can use an object to tell the story, and then it's like there is like this. They either, you know, Narsil is in pieces now; it's been reforged, and Aragorn is welding it, and that tells the story, and that's it, right? Yeah. Or like the house is deteriorating because someone is no longer taking care of themselves and it's getting messier and messier, right? Yep. Kind of, we're seeing like a process. Maverick is clinging on to the dog tags and then he throws them away. The fly does not actually change, and that makes it interesting.
Yeah, but the dog tags don't change either, but the relationship does change. And I think from what you're saying, Walt's relationship to the fly also changes.
Yeah, that's true. Yep.
So it's not like I'm not saying that talismans can't change. Objects do change. You've just, Narsil gets reforged. Things might degrade or improve, and those can be external dramatizations and reflections of interior journeys. But and one of the categories we're going to look at of classic in our taxonomy of classic talismans is photos. But the perfect one where I think it's a MacGuffin, not a talisman, is in Back to the Future. And obviously that photo changes because the family members are slowly being erased as he is failing to correct the timeline.
Great Scott! Let me see that photograph again of your brother. Just as I thought. This proves my theory. Look at your brother.
His head's gone. It's like it's been erased.
Erased from existence.
The object is changing physically before his eyes, and it is a reflection of Marty's plot success, and in that way he's imbued emotional attachment to it. But it's not to the talisman, it's to him rescuing himself and his family and his timeline.
Which is interesting because I think the photo, to contrast it with 80s movie also with a character who's clinging onto a photo, is Kyle Reese in the original Terminator.
John Connor gave me a picture of you once. I didn't know why at the time. It was very old, torn, faded. You were young like you are now. You seemed just a little sad. I used to always wonder what you were thinking at that moment. I memorized every line, every curve. I came across time for you, Sarah. I love you. I always have.
That's kind of built up as a reveal because he doesn't take it back in time with him, but we see that he ends up having a photo of Sarah Connor. And it's interesting because I think, is it talismanic or is it just like plot?
Oh, 100%. Kyle has a huge amount of emotional attachment to that photo. Like there is a flashback showing Kyle in the future, like under warfare, and that photo is bringing him peace, inspiration,
Yeah, and then it ends up burning.
Yes, but it's how he falls in love with Sarah before he's met Sarah.
Yeah, and then we see it connect to them. So it's interesting because I think it's serving plot work, but the power of that photo is the meaning that the character is giving to it.
Yeah. Well, without him telling Sarah that story, we wouldn't be given that access.
Are you frustrated with existing screenwriting software options that are designed to be a formatting tool and not much else?
Well, screenwriting just got easier. Arc Studio actually understands how screenwriters think. They've created screenwriting software that doesn't distract with an overloaded interface. Subtweeting there. So you can write without distraction.
Say goodbye to archaic, outdated screenwriting software and hello to advanced story building features, industry standard automatic formatting, and importantly, stress-free collaboration tools that are as easy to use as Google Docs.
It is about bloody time. Arc Studio is used by beginners and professionals alike, not saying where Stu and I sit in that spectrum, such as the team behind the Netflix show Arcane and David Wayne, writer-director of Wet Hot American Summer and Role Models.
Join the thousands of screenwriters who have already made the leap. Arc Studio offers a completely free plan, and you can also get $30 off the pro plan if you visit the link in our show notes or go to the link arcstudiopro.com/draft0, and draft zero as in draft zero, the word. So I say again, $30 off there's a completely free version, or you can also get $30 off the pro plan if you go to arcstudiopro.com/draft0, ZERO.
The link is in the show notes. You don't have to write this down.
Awesome if you do.
I think another example that I can think of here, which is another classic category of talismans, is the necklace in Titanic, right? It is a MacGuffin for the almost entire runtime of the movie. It is something that characters are pursuing, right? So it's Bill Paxton and his crew. The only reason they are exploring the Titanic is to find this necklace, right? And then Rose shows up, starts telling them the story. Billy Zane, most of his journey is basically to run around trying to find that necklace while also, protecting his fragile sense of masculinity. But it actually becomes a talisman in that final scene where Rose reveals that she's had it the whole time and lets it go, because at that point, she's had it the whole time. She's not chasing it. It's not a MacGuffin. It's not a plot device. To her, it purely is representing her memory of Jack, and she lets it go in the same way that Maverick throws Goose's dog tags into the sea. And so it's not that something has to be a talisman throughout the entire runtime.
No, sometimes it's a talisman for a scene.
Yeah.
I wish I could come up with a quick example.
Other than the one I just mentioned.
Oh, as you said, they're kind of searching for it. Okay. I mean, look, I think Jewel. Look, okay, I'll come back and say photos often have meaning to characters. I think their weakness is they're hard to integrate well. I think we saw Back to the Future and the Terminator are both integrated really well with the characters.
Yes.
That one of them is more plot based, one of them is more meaning, emotional connection based. But the expositional, I think the wall of photos of Goose in Top Gun Maverick, as in the sequel, is a lot more just expositional, right? They're not talismanic, right? Because they're not even like hinting. They're not. If they are talismanic, oh yes, they have a meaning, a symbolic meaning to the character. They're not doing much beyond that because they're not integrated. So all those like, we're going to show the photo of the someone's family on the computer or in their wallet, right? It's not very integrated into the story or the plot or the characters' lives, right? And I think that's why, to bring us to like another common category, is jewelry, which is what you're just specifically talking about. And we've been talking about the Ring of Power, right? And and it's also, and we talked about Arwen, and then they used the bloody Morning Star, like the necklace that she gave Aragorn to wear, and its light starts fading because the light of the Eldar fading, and it's so over the top. That's the reason they use that. But this is stuff. It comes out from the fact that people do pass jewelry down. There was a whole thing in my family about my grandma's ring, and then anyway,
I've got so much shit that my mum has. I've got a grandfather clock. It's a 300-year-old clock in my kitchen that I really wish was not there because my mum doesn't have anywhere else to store it. But she's got all this emotional attachment to my family heritage, and I come from not quite lineage, but my great-grandfather was like Lord Fisher of Lambeth. But my mum attaches huge amounts of emotional attachment to all these like little objects, like an ashtray with an insignia on it and stuff like that she's handing me all this and goes like, this is your history, look after it. I'm like, when you die, I will get rid of all of this trash.
Wow.
Because I have no emotional attachment
to it.
Yeah, in the will, only my sister out of the three of us has any say over chattels, because my mum knows that my brother and I will just throw everything away.
I mean, that's interesting because it means you have no emotional attachment, right?
Yeah.
And that shows that it's something that has to be earned or shown, right? Rather than just assumed. Okay. And jewelry can be very personal, right? That people pass things down. I've got a pair of cufflinks from my dad. I've got, the suit jacket I wear is my grandfather's and I feel connection. But I think some of that stuff isn't necessarily even between like connecting us to other people. Sometimes it connects us to earlier versions of ourselves, right?
Definitely. Well, that's going to Scott's thing about it being a reminder.
Yeah, it kind of, and that's why it's useful for storytelling, because it kind of can give us, okay, this is not jewelry, and it's another example, but it's what's coming to mind. Because as I mentioned earlier, I'm finally finishing off the current season of Boys season 3, and Soldier Boy has a trigger. So there's this character, superhero, who's been dead, basically the evil Captain America version in The Boys, has kind of been pulled out of being experimented on in Russia, and he comes back, and it turns out he's got this trigger of this certain kind of music, which basically means he wipes out a city block kind of thing, right? That music is a talisman for that character, right? And it's music, it's taken to a very specific thing, but they use that to go into flashbacks, right? To tell you why he's connected to this and why this music is a trigger, and to reveal the trauma that he's gone through. And I think you can use jewelry and those kinds of objects to have that option of going, okay, we're going to explain just in moments where these things have come from.
Well, we had previously referred to the top in Inception because we were talking about the ending in Inception, and the top is also referenced by Scott in his blog post as a talisman. It's imbued with certainly intellectual importance to the story, such that in the end it prompts an intellectual question, and it actually represents visually Cobb incepting his wife, right? He puts the top spinning inside the safe. And so Nolan treating that more intellectually, and we discussed in that ending how that top could have had more emotional resonance by Cobb, playing it more as a decision for Cobb to leave it behind and walk away from it. In that moment, Nolan has made a series of decisions, both on the page and in execution, to not imbue that top with emotional attachment for Cobb. He just sets it spinning and walks away.
That's interesting.
And, talking about integration, talking about highlighting, and we even read it out in the pages. But the reason why I was thinking about Inception is what you were just talking about in terms of Soulja Boy's trigger. They also use the Edith Piaf music in that as the trigger, like an emotional resonance, that piece of music.
It's talismanic. Yeah, it is actually.
100%.
It really is. That's great. And look, I think the reason that jewelry is a useful device is that for a lot of people, jewelry is something that we wear. I've got on the moment, and it's not a wedding band, but I've got like a ring I've been wearing for like 15 years that I bought in Scotland, and it takes me back there and all that kind of stuff, right? So it's something that lasts, and obviously can also last multi-generational, and particularly in terms of the West, there's a whole bunch of meaning associated with jewelry and the purpose of jewelry and putting your wealth into jewelry.
Yeah.
If you couldn't trust banks, then you actually put it in jewelry, and that's what was important, right? And the thing with jewelry is it's also something that people actually take with them, right? Now, there was this weird moment, speaking of photos and jewelry and keeping things, because it's a film of its time, I watched While You Were Sleeping for the first time, and it's the Sandra Bullock comedy where she gets mistaken as the fiance of a person that's in a coma, and she ends up like pulling out his wallet and finding all these photos of himself that kind of tells us a bit of a backstory of who he is, and I'm like,
who keeps pictures of themselves?
And it kind of works at the end because you're like, oh, that guy is definitely a narcissist. It's great. I really like it. It uses some plot devices that feel really Shakespearean, and I was like, is this a loose adaptation? And apparently it isn't. But like, it feels like this could have been like that structure, someone being mistaken as the spouse of like someone that's in like a Sleeping Beauty kind of thing, like all the mistaken identity stuff, classic Shakespearean comedy stuff. Anyway, so jewelry, I think, is a really useful device for that reason. And I think that actually also leads us into the next common category, because it's kind of related to jewelry, because I think in terms of heirlooms, it's often used in the same way, which is weapons, right? So Lord of the Rings, we've just talked about Narsil a bunch. There's a whole bunch of things to do with the meaning of these things that are passed along. This is Sting, I Give It To You, lightsabers, right?
Oh, that's my I mean, it shit so many fans, but that was one I was thinking in terms of emotional attachment, like Rey presenting Luke with his father's lightsaber, and, JJ going, this is a moment of huge import, and Rian Johnson just shitting all over that by having Luke go, Yeah,
which a lot of people hated. It treats it with such disrespect. And I'm like, your father murdered lots of children with this lightsaber.
Yeah.
So weapons are used talismanically, and they're often connected to action because, literally the point of a weapon is it's a tool of violence. So Die Hard, you get Al pulling the trigger of his gun at the end. I think that is talismanic.
What'd you do? Run over your captain's foot with the car.
I shot a kid. He was 13 years old. Oh, it was dark. I couldn't see him. He had a ray gun, looked real enough. You know, when you're a rookie, they can teach you everything about being a cop except how to live with a mistake. Anyway, I just couldn't bring myself to draw my gun on anybody again.
Him not being able to pull the trigger is meaningful to the character, and it's about him not being a good cop anymore, and because he's now able to exercise violence and kill someone, he's a good person.
But it's tracking a character journey. It's using a tangible, physical, external object. And in that, it's probably more of a choice, but it is related to, you know, I've not been able to pull my gun since, or that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. And so I do think weapons have got a whole bunch of meaning with people, and are connected to the fact that, you know, at a certain time they would have been expensive and they got passed down. And it is all about doing meaning. I remember when when they did the gun buyback here, when John Howard passed the laws, my dad was like, do you want my uncle's 22? And I'm like, no, not really. And my dad's like, me neither. It wasn't me neither. Like, he knew it was the right thing to do, but it was this thing of like, this feels like I've been handed down someone's like 20 farm rifle, and this feels like it's something that, you know, we should have meaning to, but we don't. We didn't. Yeah. And so in terms of the buyback scheme, we gave it in. But there's other people's, you know, I'm going to inherit my grandfather's riding crop. You know, my children are going to inherit a collection of swords, including the replica Narsil, but, you know.
God, my children are going to inherit a whole lot of obsolete physical media.
What do we do with this shiny disc?
Anyway, one of the things, so there's lots of movies in terms of weapons where there's like a physical enemy to defeat. It's often about the tracking the protagonist learning skills to be able to defeat it, right? Now,
and it's connected to heritage or some superpowers. Yes, absolutely.
You know, like obviously Luke in Star Wars, they don't need him to have mastered the lightsaber, and you've got Ben whispering in his ear. They've actually got characters doing it, not a talisman to reflect Luke's, and he makes a choice, right? So they're using different tools to track Luke's journey and his ability to defeat it. But in The Matrix, there's that whole scene where Neo goes to the Oracle and he's interacting with that kid about the spoon.
Do not try and bend the spoon. That's impossible. Instead, only try to realize the truth.
What truth?
There is no spoon.
And the spoon is obviously not a weapon, right? But you have that whole scene where the spoon is actually the visual representation of how Neo must interact with the Matrix in order to succeed. And it is obviously no coincidence that before he jumps, later on in the movie, he says, there is no spoon.
Yeah, and it's great. It's a great single scene that dramatizes an idea, and you're able to build a whole bunch of meaning around. What it makes me think of is that weapons are the most common category because of, particularly at least in Western cinema, because of the emphasis on violence, right?
Well, they're action. They're tools of action.
Yeah, they're tools. That really, I'm saying that like the larger category is a talisman that is really useful is a tool, right? Weapons are a particular kind of tool, but you could easily do a film about like, hey, this is my grandfather's shovel, and then you like learn how to dig a hole with the shovel. I'm not sure where I'm going with that, but like,
well, one of the things I was wanting to draw a comparison with is that often talismans are obviously like a physical dramatization of something, and there's whole categories of film where, like sports films, you don't need a talisman per se because there's another metric, right? Do they sports good, right? Is the metric. You can track how the internal journey of the character is going because they sports bad or they sports good, depending on how they are internally. Right. And the reason why this jumped into my head is because I watched Cool Runnings with the kids the other day. And that is almost like it's almost a perfect sports movie. But nearly every sports movie has the moment where the team is given either the new equipment or the new uniforms so that their newfound feelings of skill and self-confidence they've earned this external representation of it.
You won't believe what I had to go through to get us a sled in such good shape. If we're going to make it into the Olympics, this is the boat that's going to take us there. Well, I'm told she's actually quite fast. No, she's not much to look at, but, she's beautiful.
And that happens in Cool Runnings. It happens in Mighty Ducks. It happens in most sports movies, is that moment near the end, near the final thing, that they get the new weapon or the new uniform or the new talisman, which is imbued with meaning to them. It's a tiny moment. It's almost like it's less talismanic because it's more representative of the work that they've already done.
Yeah, it's more symbolic rather than... But there is a version of that, and I can't think of specific examples, but I think, the type where someone is using a particular tool and then the tool breaks and they believe they no longer can succeed because they thought it was the tool, the musical instrument or the paintbrush or whatever it was. And then it's like, no, the gift was always in you. So I think tools, because that Cars is absolutely an extension of it, right? So we just talked about Back to the Future, but also the way that Cars looks, people's relationship to Cars definitely give personality. Little Miss Sunshine, right? Like the van in that is very talismanic. It's definitely representing the character. A lot of road movies.
Is it though? I mean, I think that's more symbolic than talismanic, the car in Little Miss Sunshine. But one of the examples I can think of, because I'm a little bit like a lot of people obsessed with Cobra Kai, the car that Mr. Miyagi gives Daniel-san, like the collection of cars that Daniel ends up having are symbolic of his relationship with Mr. Miyagi.
Cool.
But that's because of the emotional attachment that Daniel gives to it. I mean, the reason why I'm in terrible impro form, I'm knowing your Little Miss Sunshine suggestion, is because to me, the van is more of an obstacle. It's not that at some point they all go, oh, we need to go and save the van because it means so much to us and it's symbolic of this whole journey that we've gone through.
Yeah, and the space van, which is, the Millennium Falcon, has yes, it's got a whole bunch of meaning to it. But it's not necessarily, it's talismanic without being used to track journey, right?
Sure, but I mean, often Han is making decisions to risk his own life to get the Millennium Falcon back.
Yeah, because it's clearly means a lot to Han as a character.
Yeah, so that's what I mean is it's talismanic because he has emotional attachment to that ship.
Oh, and there's a whole bunch, the car in Gran Torino, I would say the Interceptor in Mad Max. I mean, that's what was so interesting about Fury Road, was throwing away the Interceptor in a way. And you can see it, the deterioration or the quality of a car reflecting ascent or descent in how you use vehicles is a great way of tracking that stuff.
Yeah.
Moving away from tools and coming back to this idea of characters having a relationship that allows them to communicate, I think another very common talisman is letters and journals. So speaking of Star Wars in Andor, without giving too many spoilers away, there is a moment where Cassian Andor is given a journal, basically a little, almost like a...
it's described as a manifesto.
It's a manifesto, right? Literally given a manifesto from another character.
We've grown reliant on Imperial tech and we've made ourselves vulnerable. There's a growing list of things we've known and forgotten, things they've pushed us to forget. Things like freedom.
Nemik sees oppression everywhere.
Skeen pretends not to listen, but I know the message is sinking in.
He's writing a manifesto.
And that manifesto is hugely imbued with meaning, and it works because we know it's meaningful to him at the time, but also we're like, this is how he's going to be even further radicalized into the rebels, right?
But it's important because he refuses it as well. The accepting of that object is accepting things that he doesn't want that emotional attachment. He doesn't want to pay that emotional cost.
And also the idea is what he is symbolic of. This is a manifesto of someone who likes to think of themselves as I don't want to, I'm a mercenary. I'm not fighting for a cause. Getting and receiving a manifesto is I'm beginning to take on the meaning of this cause. So it's a great tracking. We understand in that moment, as does Andor, right, that this is a moment where he is beginning to realize that he is being radicalized.
Well, it's also fascinating that scene happens to be right after a scene where he is confronted by a character who actually embodies whom Andor thinks of himself.
Oh, that was a great beat.
And Andor realizes that he's been lying to himself, that he's not that. He's not that mercenary. We're tiptoeing around spoilers. I'm not, let's spoil the fuck out of Andor. We spoil the fuck out of everything else.
It's fresh.
By the time this comes out, 2 more episodes will have dropped.
All right. So specifically, this is the spoiler. We tiptoed around it. If you want to be spoiled, otherwise we'll put a chapter mark in and you can skip this little bit. So it's basically the manifesto that Andor takes after his friend has been killed, the one who's actually the true believer and who's been writing this kind of like very like radicalist approach, is being told to take this book.
I'm not sure it's fair to call it radical. I feel it's idealized. So whenever that character, it's the youngest of the people planning the heist with Andor, and whenever he's spoken of the things that he's writing in that manifesto, Andor has said that's like, essentially, that's not how real life works.
Yeah.
Because this kid suffered at the hands of fascism, of the empire, and is writing a call to arms for why people should join the rebellion and why they should fight the empire. And Andor is constantly resisting that, not only because in his own mind he doesn't want to be fighting the empire, he's just being a gun for hire. And then when actually confronted with the choice to take 40 million credits, which seems like a lot, he's risking his life for 40,000 credits, so 40 million seems like a lot. And a character saying, I am a rebel, it's me against everyone else. Right? Which is how Andor has kind of been portraying himself. It's me against everyone else. I do not have a team or an alliance. I'm not attached to a cause. And when he hears that guy is going to make off with the heist, with all the money that they have, and split it with him, he murders that guy. Is the character's name Skeen? Skeen, I think it was. Because he wants, I guess, what I'm assuming from that decision is that he wants the Alliance to still have that money. I say the Alliance, the rebellion.
The cause.
Yes.
Let's say the cause in general. Yes. Yeah, so it's very imbued with meaning, and it's a great moment of a talisman, right? Because we have seen it. It's been, I'm going to introduce some ideas. I'm going to use Scott's terminology about something else, but I think it's been brought into focus. I think there's a better word than reminder, but there is like a connection, but I want to use connection in another way. There is a reminder of a specific thing, and there is a connection between the character and the object. So,
but isn't that not the emotional attachment? To use Scott's other category of import.
Yeah, so this is interestingly. So Scott was just talking about the use of talismans for writers in terms of their personal life to help them get in the zone of writing. And I was like, you need to pick an object, and often people use playlists. I know Jennifer Hutchinson, she's got different keyboards for different projects. Often people will be like, this is my spot. This is the time I start. This is the cup of coffee. Like a lot of people have rituals. A lot of artists have rituals. It's like bloody sort of Federer, what's the other tennis player that sits there and has like all the crazy rituals of wiping his face? Nadal, right? Like absolutely ritualized. Like this is like a mindfulness thing. So Scott's kind of talking to that, and he's talking about you need to pick something that gives you a point of focus. When your mind is wandering, you can use this to pull you in. It is a reminder of the story that you're writing. And then he's got this idea that it connects you to the story world. I've got playlists for certain projects because they kind of do everything of that. They focus me on there. They remind me of what I'm writing on, and they connect me to the tone of it. But I actually think in terms of a talisman that we use for our characters and their relationship and where they sit the boundary, it's actually really interesting. We talked about awareness and visibility, but I like focus because it's like, how in focus is this thing? Are we saying this is something you need to pay attention to? The reminder, we're actually maybe imprint is a better word. There is basically something that is imprinted that we understand the meaning of it. And then there is the connection between the characters and that object, right? And I think that what we're seeing there is something that's had focus put onto it. It is imprinted with a whole bunch of meaning, and there is a connection between the characters and it.
I don't want to interrupt. I think imprinting is a good verb, but the way that I see it is the imprinting that happens. The way is the communication between the storyteller and the audience, because it's how the storyteller chooses to convey to the audience how important this object is to the character.
Yeah, I think the imprinting goes both ways. The character has to have a meaning connected to it and the audience. But I suppose, because for me, focus is the audience being told that this is important, and the imprinting is the moment where the character has meaning connected to it.
And you might not, as you pointed out, you know, it can be a reveal, like something is super important to a character, and when it reveals that moment of imprinting, when did the character give import to this object, may be revealed at a different time in the story to when the audience learns. You know, that's just a POV choice.
Is there anything more to say with Andor other than it's a really good example of a talisman? No? Let's move on.
One of the final examples, and I should have talked about it when we were talking about Jewellery, is the watch from Pulp Fiction. Because if you didn't have that incredible flashback to that basic, almost one shot of Christopher Walken talking at length about how many asses that watch has been through to get to Butch.
This watch was on your daddy's wrist when they were shot down over Hanoi. He was captured, put in a Vietnamese prison camp. He knew that if the gooks ever saw the watch, it'd be confiscated, taken away. The way your dad looked at it, this watch was your birthright. You'd be damned if any slope's going to put the greasy yellow hands on his boy's birthright, so he hid it. In one place he knew he could hide something, his ass. 5 long years he wore this watch, up his ass. Then he died of dysentery. He gave me the watch. I hid this uncomfortable hunk of metal up my ass 2 years. Then, after 7 years, I was sent home to my family, and now, little man, I give the watch to you.
Butch's decision to risk his life to get that watch back, we would understand as an audience that it's important because Butch is risking his life to get that watch back. But Tarantino chooses to let us know how emotionally important it is to Butch, such that we are on board with his decision to risk his life multiple times to get that watch back. So that you totally buy that Butch almost gets killed by John Travolta and Ving Rhames later in the story just to get that watch back.
I mean, it's connected, like we talked about character value, you know, in the stakes episode. We need to understand stakes come from characters valuing things, and we understand what he values there. Okay, I want to come back to letters and journals because we use the journal, the manifesto, as one type of meaning. But there's another one that can be more plot integrated, which is an example you want to pull from Promising Young Woman.
Yeah.
We've mentioned it earlier at the beginning of the year. This episode's, interestingly, a whole bunch of little tendrils to other episodes.
When we did Promising Young Woman, what was the context in which we looked at it? Was it genre?
Yeah, keeping genre fresh.
Yeah. Because in that, what we were looking at is how basically it was like a revenge thriller coupled with a rom-com, and how those two different genres were pulling the main character from one story to the other. But the revenge thriller was not just characterized, not just dramatized by her decisions to go out and try and trap these quote-unquote good guys in their own lies, nor to avenge her friend against her rapist, Al Monroe. But one of the things I picked up on was that the journal that she kept of all the guys that she had entrapped, like it was a tally and she had their names written in there. And also she had her plan to get back at Al Monroe and all the other people who had led to her friend's suicide, in her view. So that journal was very much talismanic. Now, importantly for me is that journal was not driving the plot in any way. At no point does she go out of her way to get that journal back. Does anyone else discover the journal and ask her about it? It's not about the plot in any way. It is purely her, right? And her decision at one point, she literally throws the journal away as a dramatization of her giving up on the revenge thriller
storyline.
Yeah. So to me, like, journals and letters are quite useful as talismans because they can actually, to my mind, represent characters, because they are either the character talking to themselves in a journal form, or a letter, it's other characters talking to them, and you can have them read out, right? So then it's essentially characters talking. But in this particular case, a promising young woman, the journal was an object, right? It didn't talk to her. She didn't talk to it. She wasn't journaling her feelings. It was a tally. It was a representation of her commitment to avenging her friend, Nina.
That's a good way to do it. So she was aware of what it meant. All right. So should we move to wrap up or like thinking points for the next episode?
Yes.
Because what I'm beginning to feel in talking about this is that the more a character is aware of what something means, and the more we're aware of what it means, the more powerful it is, because it actually positions us in a position of empathy, because it gives us access to interiority, allows us to have empathy with the character. Like talismans, as we talked about, can do a whole bunch of things, and they may only be a small thing like there is no spoon. They may be like a plot motivator like Breaking Bad, but like throwing away Goose's dog tags, right? Throwing away the journal. These are all throwing away things, but they allow us to experience with the character or understand what they're doing without them having to verbalize it. And we're kind of with them as they let it go. So I think or when Andor accepts the manifesto, we understand that he understands what that kind of may mean. We obviously, if you've seen Rogue One, it carries a little bit more weight, but I think the moment still works. You know, Andor's great as a prequel, talking about like connecting us to biopics episodes. It's like, it is a prequel that's working really well because no one is acting like plot armor, right? Andor looks terrified most of the time. You know, these ideas of like, there's focus of visibility, there's this thing of imprinting, there's connection between the character, this is the talisman. But I also think there's other things that are important, which is the awareness. How aware is the character of what this means? And I think this can be a spectrum, as I think we'll probably discover with THOR. I think what is interesting and what makes it funny is that we understand that his relationship with Stormbreaker means more than the way he is acting, but it clearly means something to him, and he is aware of that, but we have more context. I think there is integration. Like, basically, the reason I think maybe weapons and journals, for example, can be and wardrobe, maybe jewelry is so useful as talismans, like tools, is because they're things that characters do. So if they're things that characters either are just hanging on that person, or more importantly, stuff that they're taking action with, it becomes easier to put it on screen and show a changing relationship. It's not passive, right? It's not just something that we're witnessing. And so I think integration is really speaking to that. Photos hanging on the wall requires the camera to be like, oh, look at these photos, right? There's ways you can tell stories through objects, you know, the house deteriorating. I remember someone pitching this story of like one toothbrush in a cup on a sink, and then you see another toothbrush appear sitting on the sink, and then you got two toothbrushes in the cup together, and then the last shot is there's just back to one or something like that, right? Like, it was like the story of relationship told through toothbrushes. They're talismanic, but in that kind of story, we're not seeing any character connection to it.
Yeah, so that's not, to use our own terminology, that's not talismanic, because that's symbolic. Yeah. We're not seeing any character emotional attachment to it.
Yeah, exactly. And the last thing I think, which we haven't talked about as much, but I think we will when we break down specific examples, is specificity, right? That I think sometimes, particularly from baby, we're finding good examples as we try to do, but I think the more specific something can be and the more specific we can make it, like the watch in Pulp Fiction, the stronger it's going to be, because it gives us it makes us feel like we've got insight into the character, right? Because it's something, everyone has got clothes, everyone's got jewelry, right? But if there's like a story that you can tell, like, oh, this is my like, you've got a clock, but it's not just a clock, it's a grandfather clock. And there's a whole story about your grandfather clock, about the fact that you had to bring it. Didn't it come from England or something insane?
It went to Africa and then back to England and then here.
Yeah, so it's very specific, and it tells a little bit about your story, your family's colonizing history. So I think specificity is something that we're going to dive into, but I think good talismans are specific, right? That they and that's part of their power, is they make us feel connected to the character, because it gives us insight into who they are, and kind of broadens them as having a life outside of the story world, and also may give us more insight into the story world. What about you?
I want to say, just comment on your thing about them being more powerful. They're powerful in the same way that we talked about narrative point of view with endings is that these things gain power if the audience is in with empathy with the character. So you could have a character who has a talisman and we know it's a talisman, but we don't know what the emotional attachment is because we haven't explained it to the audience.
Yeah.
Right? A character might constantly be looking at something and we know the thing that they're looking at, but we don't know what it means. And it's only when we catch up or are told about what it means to that character and that then the character's relationship shifts with that talisman that is very powerful.
We're using powerful to really mean emotional power rather than...
Which is what we're talking about in terms of a measure of something being a talisman or not, is the emotional attachment a character has. Like, ultimately what we're talking about in terms of any story is relationships. And just in this episode, we're studying the relationships of human characters with inanimate objects for the most part. The biggest, I guess, thing that I have to reassess is how inanimate those objects are. You know, I think you make a point that everything's a spectrum, like how sentient is something, how much free will does something have.
I think I have already got your answer, which is that for Aristotle, character is not just action. Character is habitual action, right? And I think the habit is the important thing. Okay, if an object is acting seemingly at random or so inconsistently, like the ring of power, we only see it maybe there's I've not counted, but maybe there's like 5 moments over the course of like nearly 10 hours where it seemingly takes action. I wouldn't say that is habitual action, right? And I think you're probably right that Stormbreaker in the context of Thor is acting habitually, right? And it's beginning to transform into an R2-D2, right?
Much more than Mjolnir. So it's just helpful with Thor to have a really distinct other object to contrast it with, which I think it's going to be a good episode to talk about Stormbreaker in contrast to Mjolnir.
Because I wonder if that will change, like, what is the effect of that emotionally and the thinking and the feeling, right? Which is the way because I just think, like, emotion has an intellectual element, but I just sometimes think it's really useful to go, there is, like, effect on the way people think about things and the way they feel about things. And often they're in alignment, but they may not be. I wish there was a better way of articulating it. Emotion, but I don't want to say intellectual because thinking isn't necessarily, like, thinking can be emotional and emotional can, I don't know.
I'm going to be such a douche for saying this. I'm 2 fairly powerful beers in, but I think Inception would have been a better film had Cobb's relationship with the top been more emotional and less intellectual.
That is classic Nolan, though.
And I think to my wrap-up learnings about this is, you know, talismans can be MacGuffins. They can be characters. They can be all these other things. The use of a talisman is how much that you as the storyteller wish to convey to the audience the emotional relationship that the character has with this object.
Yeah, and potentially with that, using less words. Right, like it can save you dialogue. Like, I'm letting you go, Goose. I mean, he could do it. And probably in modern films, he probably would be like, I've got to let you go, Goose. And he throws it. I don't know.
Yeah.
Because we seemingly, I've talked about this before, but, you know, I think big popular films kind of actually have to communicate on multiple levels because what's interesting about cinema as a medium is that it combines so many things. It combines performance, it combines like imagery, it combines music, it combines like composition. There's all these multiple ways that movies create meaning, and not every person is literate in every particular way, or aesthetically sensitive is another term that I've heard, right? So some people, they're like, I don't need the dialogue. I understand what that action means. And other people will be like, I have no idea what that action means, but the dialogue tells me what it means. Other people will respond to the music. And I think if you're doing popular cinema, of course you're going to try and hit all areas at once to communicate to the widest possible audience.
Yeah. And this is going to be less of a learning from this episode and more hopefully a teaser for our next episode is, I think when a physical object is naturally integrated with the plot, it might be a MacGuffin, or it might be Wilson from Castaway, or it might be a weapon where, you know, the mastery of that weapon leads to the plot success, or it might be a golf club or a bat or a ball or something in a sports movie.
Or a location, which is why I want to talk about In the Mood for Love.
The reason why I'm interested in our next episode looking really at how talismans can be used to dramatize the interiority of a character is where I think talismans are useful as a rewriting tool. Because often if we come up with a great idea that features characters interacting with a physical object, where that's part of the idea, it should be fairly easy rewriting to imbue that physical object with character attachment. Obviously, better writers than me failed at that in the sequels to National Treasure and Indiana Jones and Pirates of the Caribbean, where they succeeded in the earlier editions. So maybe it's not as obvious as I'm saying, but to me, the real value that I'm looking forward to exploring in the next episode is just where there isn't as much plot interaction with the physical object. How can we just have an additional string to our bow where even in a scene or maybe throughout the whole film or, TV series, how can we better externalize and dramatize the internal?
I'm going to just slightly pick up on that idea of those later films not doing it because they weren't building objects with relationships with characters. I actually think we also have the challenge now where films and shows are struggling, basically use quote unquote Easter eggs, where objects have meanings to the audience, right? They already have symbolic meaning to the audience, and we kind of for the lack of a better word, get lazy about creating that meaning for the character. Right. And I think that's where some problems come from, because it's like, oh, look at this, they should understand. And sometimes that can be fun, right? It can be fun because we know something, like it can be a narrative point of view, but it gets frustrating to me when it's like, look at this thing that has meaning, like the fan service stuff. But I think that can be a problem in not just the big franchises, but it can be in prequels. It can also be in stuff like horrors and stuff like that, where you're building up on a large kind of intertextual. For some reason, The Exorcist comes to mind, but maybe that's just Halloween.
Is that just because she's fucking the crucifix?
Yeah, well, wow. Yeah, that's a place, Dan. But it's important in that film that not only is it absolutely drenched in Christian iconography, it's absolutely important that they're believers. At least one character is a believer. So we understand that this is deeply meaningful for them. They believe this reality. I mean, that's why The Exorcist is so scary, is it doesn't treat its world with a wink. The objects have meaning within this world because they have a supernatural element which the characters believe. And I think is similar to, Lord of the Rings and Star Wars and all that kind of stuff. But it's important that they show that the characters believe what they mean. Anyway.
Thanks as always to our amazing patrons who bring you guys more Draft Zero more often. Can you imagine how infrequently we would release were it not for our Patreons? But in particular, thanks to Alex, Bjorn, Casimir, Eduardo, Garrett, Jennifer, Jesse, Crob, Randy, Sandra, and I'm going to say Theus, but I think I met someone with the name Theus this past summer when I was in Europe, and I think it's pronounced Tees, something like that. Anyway, I'm done a stew and embarrassed myself with my pronunciation.
If you feel so compelled to argue with Chaz and myself about anything on this episode or anything in general, you can find many ways to contact us at draft-zero.com.
And there you will also find the show notes for this episode, as well as links to
share the word and rate and review us on Apple Podcasts.
And if you're feeling even more supportive, you can also find links to our Patreon page.
And thanks for listening.